Also, a dramatic morning in healthcare here in Washington. President Donald Trump kicked off the day with a morning tweet warning of the midterm elections debacle if an Obamacare repeal isn't passed. He said with his thumbs today, the Freedom Caucus will hurt the entire Republican agenda if they don't get on the team and fast. We must fight them and the Dems in 2018. He's pointing to the stalwart opposition by conservative House Freedom Caucus members to the GOP proposed Obamacare repeal bill. It was a humiliating failure for the House and the Republican Party in general. The Freedom Caucus members, including Jim Jordan of Ohio, have weighed in. Jim Jordan says, "I respect the president, but our focus is on the legislation." Well, the focus on legislation will be gone for many Republican members if they lose elections to Democrats in the midterms of 2018 if a repeal isn't passed. Hadley Heath Manning, Director of Health Policy for the Independent Women's Forum, joined me to weigh in on where conservatives like her are coming from, even after their promises to repeal Obamacare after 7 years were not made good on. And what are they going to do now? Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
If there's one thing that last week taught us is that we are united around shared goals. Now, how we go about implementing our vision is sometimes where we differ, but I am confident. I'm confident in our ability to come together, unify around shared goals.
Some people are asking, shared goals? She's got to be kidding us. We saw a splintering of the GOP. What's going on here? How are people supposed to absorb her words?
Well, I think at a 30,000-foot level, the chairwoman has a point. You know, there were four goals that Speaker Ryan articulated during the course of events last week and the weeks prior. He said lower costs, more choices, patients in control, and universal access to care. But those words often need more defining and better communication. So I think part of the reason why Republicans weren't able to get their effort over the finish line last week and why they've got more work to do moving forward is they've got to articulate why they're doing what they're doing and what those goals really mean in policy terms.
Well, let's talk about the near unified opposition from the Freedom Caucus. First public casualty, Representative Ted Poe resigned. The opposition, the reason being the opposition to the Republican health care plan. The Freedom Caucus is probably feeling a lot of heat right now, but it's not something new for them. Still, this does sort of make a statement about what's going on the inside. And the public is paying attention to that because what we hear outside of the closed-door meetings, you know, is an indication of that, wouldn't you say?
That's right. So I think it was William Buckley who said conservatives are people who sort of stand athwart history yelling stop. And conservatives are very good at being against things. They've been against things for 8 years when President Obama was in office. But now there's been a very seismic shift in the political landscape. And I think some Republicans are struggling to adjust to that, to the fact that they have to govern. Governing means passing legislation that isn't perfect. You know, this side of heaven, we won't have perfect laws, but we can improve upon the status quo. And I believe the reason Representative Poe said that he was leaving the Freedom Caucus was because he didn't want to be simply in the party of no. And of course, if the Freedom Caucus ends up eventually coming to the table, getting some of their demands met, then they could be well known for having a great deal of influence. And that's, of course, what the deal-making process looks like. But if they're going to say no to any plan, no matter what, then, of course, that's not productive.
Well, and how can you have an upper hand any more than they already do in the House and the Senate? The White House. Now, Speaker Ryan said at this same press conference Tuesday, we all have to reflect on what we could have done better. We're united around a common set of principles. What could they have done better in this situation? Was it just having to deal with sort of a mandate from the White House and then pushing against that? I mean, how could they have handled this better from an optics standpoint even?
Right. Well, I think it was Newt Gingrich who said, you know, they were working with sort of an arbitrary deadline, pushing the vote to the floor when the caucus, when the whole set of House Republicans hadn't decided behind closed doors that they had the votes, ended up in an embarrassment for the Republican Party because eventually they had to pull the vote from the floor. So I believe better communication inside of the Republican caucuses and also better communication with constituents. You know, the American people are very divided when it comes to the next steps for health care. Some people say they need to change the Affordable Care Act. Some people say repeal it. A very small number of people want to keep things as they are. But of course, if Republicans are going to make changes, if they're going to take steps to repeal it and replace it, then they need to lay the groundwork, do the education, and do the persuasion with the American public that their specific actions are those that are needed to address the real problems in the healthcare system. Because the people who say, yes, I'm a voter and I support repealing Obamacare, those people are going to, support generally what Republicans do. It's the people in the middle that Republicans need to do a better job communicating with, and that way they won't struggle with this Tuesday group or this moderate group of Republicans who are concerned that this bill didn't do enough to transition and care for people who might have been hurt by some of the sudden changes.
Well, not only that, it's those moderates that the Republicans, as we saw in the presidential elections, didn't seem to clinch very easily as far as identifying with what they are going toward. This reeks of bully pulpit from the president, his reaction to this sort of thing. With Twitter, he says the Republican House Freedom Caucus was able to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory after so many bad years. They were ready for a win. And then he says Democrats are smiling in D.C. that the Freedom Caucus, with the help of Club for Growth and Heritage, have saved Planned Parenthood and Care. Here's the thing. Do you think he pushed this to a vote in order to hit back at whoever didn't want to pass it?
I don't think he had any way of anticipating that ultimately the differences between the House Freedom Caucus and the group of moderate Republicans would end up being a breaking point last week. If it really is true that the things that the president and Speaker Ryan said at the end of last week, that they were very close to consensus, very close to 218, then maybe it is just a matter of time before they can work out the details between those two groups. But ultimately, I think the president would prefer to move to a different agenda item. Maybe that's why he wanted to sort of pass the buck on health care and come back to it at a later date, because I believe that he really wants to address tax reform first, infrastructure, some of those other agenda items. He wants to get a win. He wants to have some points on the board before coming back to a very difficult issue like health care, which he acknowledged famously that it turns out it's very complex.
Right. And yeah, it was a surprise to him that was very complex. One of the things that I think as we move forward in this week, you and I have looked back sort of and analyzed what got us here. But as we move forward, we're talking about tax reform and infrastructure. Bundling those two things, these are very huge topics as well. What is the success rate going to be here when the GOP needs a win? I mean, what do you foresee about bundling this? Because you can bet by the end of this week into next week, they're going to have to pivot to something.
That's right. And I think each one of these things, healthcare, taxes, and infrastructure, are separate items. They certainly have a lot of overlap in the way the tax code affects health insurance, for example. But the way that Congress is going to approach these moving forward deals with different constituencies. I believe the tone is different when it comes to opportunities for bipartisanship. Healthcare specifically, they're looking to reform something that the country has just witnessed a sweeping overhaul only 7 years ago. So there's a little bit of reform fatigue in the healthcare issue, whereas tax reform, I think there's more opportunities for bipartisanship. I think it's one where Republicans can get a win if they focus on messaging correctly and if they focus on bringing together the right groups of people. So the president acknowledged, hey, we learned some lessons from this fumble on health care last week. We'll see if he's really learned those lessons and applies them moving forward. Very
well put. Now let's talk about the looking ahead to the 2018 midterms. I cannot even believe we're talking about that after the 2016 election cycle, but it's coming up so fast. If they've promised for over 7 years now to get health care reform. If they can't get a win in with a lower health care premium at the very least, what tidal wave of calamity will the GOP be facing in the 2018 elections, which we will be covering extensive right around the corner?
That's right. And I believe you're right to point out that health insurance premiums in the private individual market will be a big metric for whether or not any reforms are successful. What we'll see between now and 2018, certainly if Republicans don't come back to the health care issue immediately, health insurance companies have to file their policies and their rates over the summer, so that's going to happen very soon. And then open enrollment, of course, starts around the beginning of October, early fall. And so people will be enrolling yet again in the Affordable Care Act exchanges exchanges. And if the trend holds true, what we've seen in the past several years, the insurance companies exiting the exchanges, offering fewer choices for people, and premiums increasing in most states, at least the unsubsidized premiums that people face in those states, much higher in many of the states. So if that continues, then the frustration the American people feel with the Affordable Care Act will grow, but now they, of course, may punish both parties because they've seen the Democrats responsible for passing the legislation and Republicans responsible, maybe a sin of omission, by not repealing it in a speedy manner. And it could ultimately fuel a health care battle for early 2018 when they come to the fiscal year 2019 budget reconciliation battle. That's when I would expect this issue to get tackled. But in the meantime, the experience of everyday Americans is certainly going to shape the way that they view this law.
Right, and it's time to, if they want to saddle up for another round with their political career, they better start answering those constituent phone calls right quick. Hadley Heath Manning, always a pleasure, Director of Health Policy at the Independent Women's Forum. Take care.